Thank you for coming, everybody. I know people have come from far and wide, so great to see you here, even through Instagram as well, so thanks for coming. Fred Bason. So this is the poster that has been circulated. Writer, diarist, broadcaster, bookseller, an important witness and recorder of 20th century London, Walworth, southeast London, which is us here. So that's the photograph without all the gubbins around it. And there we have a picture of Fred, as he probably liked to be best remembered, happy, surrounded by books, loads of autographs, probably in one of his albums in front of him, and being gregarious, which he was. As you said, David, a gregarious man. Just as a quick starter, I'd like to tell everybody that all the images and text used here are copyright Southwark Archives, or me, or Antonia Enthoven at the end, and I'll explain about Antonia, or indeed the estate of Fred Bason. And the publications referred to and copied here are in the ownership of Southwark Archives, or me. And I'd like to thank David and Joanne Hammond, who are sitting up here, John Wilson, who is a bookseller, for their information and comments about first-hand meetings with Fred Bason. Although Fred is a modern figure, he died in 1973, and so there are a diminishing number of people who actually met him, which sort of tries to make him not a historical figure but a living figure in the recent past. Okay, so who was he? As we said, a bookseller, a writer, a diarist, an autograph hunter, a celebrity hunter. He was a television and radio personality. But who or why, and why are we talking about him here on the Walworth Road? Why are we not talking about him nationally? So what did he do? He was a witness to his times, locally and nationally. But why should he be remembered? Did he record local life and times around here? Did he take Walworth and Camberwell to a broader world? Was he part of the local landscape? A local celebrity, a local hero? Well, I think that's for you to judge, but I think it is time to remember. And we start off right at the beginning. Westmoreland Road was just over there. Don't know if any of you remember it. It was all cleared in the mid-70s to make way for the Aylesbury estate. And this is number 152. It's the only house in Southwark Archives on Westmoreland Road recorded, and this was where he was born and lived until 1966. And it's a bit, you can't quite see it, but he got to the point where there's a little label notice next to it saying Fred Bason, writer. And this was his Walworth, and there's not much of, I think one or two bits going into Surrey Square are a bit like this. But this was most of that part of Walworth. And an Edwardian childhood. He was born in 1907, and it was his father's second marriage and his mother's first marriage, but they were both nearly 40 when they got married, which was late, and Fred was born to them in their 40s. He was an only child, and they were quite a remote family. He spent a lot of time trying to please them, trying to do the right thing, and that never seemed to be reciprocated from what we read. And a lot of what happened later on in his life seemed to be about him looking for approval, for approbation, to gain that approval that he didn't get at home. So first I'm going to look at the public story, because most of what people know about Fred Bason is very public. he started out famously as a bookseller. He said his parents said, right, you're going to get a job at the age of 13, and first you're going to work in a barber shop just off down in Camberwell. He hated it, so he left, and they said, okay, well, you'll work in a carpenter's shop. And he was stuck at the wrong end of a planing machine, and he was covered in sawdust and the noise, and in the end he was so unwell that his doctors said to his parents, you'll kill him if you keep working doing this. And so his parents said, well, you've got to pay your rent. What are you going to do? And he had discovered that he could buy books in Walworth, give them a bit of a clean and a brush up, and sell them in the West End for a significant profit. And his parents said, we don't care, whatever you want to do, as long as you can pay the rent, you do it. And he said, right, I'm going to become a bookseller. And this is a slightly later posed photograph, but the important thing is, first of all, you can see just behind here market barrows. He used to hire a barrow. You could hire a barrow for a shilling a day, I think it was, stacked it with books. He would trundle all the way up to Tower Bridge Road and sell books. And that's how he started out. Eventually he got himself a little bookshop in Camberwell, Church Street. But this is a publicity photograph of him hamming it up slightly. And some of the things you'll see referred to, which were standard Cockney, and I'll come back to that term shortly, Cockney dress. You've got the flat cap and you've got what's called the choker. And that was, if you like, standard uniform. The term of Cockney, you'll hear him referred to as a Cockney author. And as you know, I'm a North Londoner, other North Londoners, you're from Stepney. A Cockney is somebody from that side of the river. But in those days, a Cockney was anybody with a pronounced London accent who lived in inner London. So apologies to you who think he wasn't a Cockney. Technically he wasn't, but that was the marketing of the times, if you like. So this is Fred as a bookseller, and he became very successful. He was very good at flogging books upmarket, and he would deal with Mags and Company if he found something really splendid. It started him off, and it paid. This is another more staged photograph of a younger Fred as another passion, autograph hunting, and he was fascinated by the theatre from the outset, and I'll give you a reading shortly. But this approbation, getting to know famous people, going to the theatre back doors, going to the boxing rings, the ring up at what is now Waterloo East. Yes, thank you. He was passionate about meeting famous people and that sort of glow that he got from getting to talk to people, and he was very good at getting on with them and building relationships with them. And he ended up with a huge autograph collection that unfortunately was flattened, well, it was actually soaked. His house was bombed during the war with incendiaries, and to put the fire out, the fire brigade basically flooded the cellar, which meant that all his autographs got totally sodden and had to be thrown away. Devastated. But the important thing with the autograph hunting and meeting famous people is he met this man, Somerset Maugham. Now, Somerset Maugham was probably one of the most famous writer of from about 1915, when he wrote Liza of Lambeth, all the way through until the mid-1960s. And he first published while he was training to be a doctor at St Thomas's Hospital, and he knew this area quite well. And he latched on to Fred Bason, and Fred Bason latched on to him. It started out as an autograph relationship, and it became mildly obsessive. At one point, Morm was sending a postcard once a week to him, and there's a bit in the third diary where he says, "Somerset Maugham, over the past few weeks, has written me 87 postcards. What do you think he wants?" And he was sort of, a pleasant young man. But Fred used his relationship with Maugham for financial benefit. What would happen is that Fred realized that with his book selling, if you actually got an autograph from the writer in the book, it sold for an absolute fortune, whereas a first edition just would sell for a first edition. So Maugham used to come down, pick up his local flavours from around here. He used to go to Fred's house. Fred used to take him to the South London Palace and the other music halls around here. And when he turned up for tea at Fred's, normally with presents for Fred's parents, there would also be a large stack of Somerset Maugham's books, which Somerset Maugham had to sit down and sign and sign and sign and sign on the agreement that Fred would sell them, and it would be money that Fred would make to look after him. And eventually Maugham got really fed up with this, and obviously whatever else he wanted from the relationship wasn't arriving, and so eventually in the late 1930s the relationship totally finished. But Fred never stopped using the borrowed glory of Somerset Maugham, but also it launched his career in the next section, which is actually writing. So his first book was published in 1930, when obviously, having been born in 1907, he was still very young, and was a bibliography of the writings of Somerset Maugham to that date. And it was produced in a limited edition. The one on this one was the cheaper one, which there were 950 of, and there were 50 of these which were signed by Maugham himself. And it's a bit of a sort of hagiography, I suppose all bibliographies are supposed to be. And Maugham said in the introduction, he said, "It gives me a shiver to turn its pages." This is the book. "As though somebody were walking over my grave, for it is, after all, a specification, as it were, of my life's endeavour, and that it should be thought worthwhile to draw it up suggests that my work is nearly done." Well, this is 1931, and there was another 30 years of book writing, but anyway. What's interesting is in Bason's own introduction, he starts out with, "This is not a full-length picture, it is merely a slight sketch, written without a thought to literary style, to bring this eminent author a little nearer to his readers. To sum up, I believe that there is no other man in England more worthy of recognition for his services to art. He is truly a great man," which is a bit adulatory. And unfortunately it was full of errors, and it became known as how not to write a bibliography. And he ended up sending out copies, and I have a copy which he and Maugham have both gone through, and Maugham's gone through with a blue pencil going, no. So that was the first attempt, but he was a young man, and this was his first getting of publicity. So, a great effort for somebody who basically left school at 14. So that was step one, and that's using the relationship with Somerset Maugham. The next book was Gallery Unreserved, and this came out a couple of years later, the date of publication being 1931, and this was drawing both on his experience with Maugham, who wrote the foreword, but also his love of theatre. And the gallery in those days, and this is what is now, I presume, His Majesty's Theatre, no? The gallery to that theatre, and the Galleryites in the gods, those incredibly steep steps at the top, people who bought their cheap seats, and they were noisy. If they didn't like a play, they would catcall, they'd throw stuff at the stage, they could ruin a performance in one night. Or they could make somebody's career, and it was really a sort of running the gauntlet for a lot of actors and for a lot of playwrights. And he thought, right, using my autograph experience, I'm going to write to lots of actors and actresses and playwrights and ask them to write about the gallery. And look at the people who he got to write. Maugham, yes, Baroness Orksey, Compton Mackenzie, Tallulah Bankhead. And so the number of people who contributed to this book was really quite extraordinary, because he was so good at networking. He was so good at making contacts with people. And what he says is, written from the gallery standpoint and without reserve, like the gallery itself, this is a novelty in theatrical books. So far as I know, no previous volume has been devoted in this way to Galleryites and their views, who we are, and our preferences and prejudices. I can't claim to be simply representative, of course. Likes and dislikes differ in the gallery as elsewhere. But as far as possible, I have endeavoured to express the greatest common measure of upstairs experience and opinion, and I do so frankly and fearlessly. And so, and he ends, we may be outspoken in the gallery, and they certainly were, really noisy, but we are not vindictive, and in the last analysis, all we want is simply to enjoy ourselves as well as we possibly can, to add to the gaiety of nations. Is there anything of greater importance? So there's this basic good-heartedness about what Fred Bason does and what he writes. Also, if that wasn't enough, selling books and collecting autographs, one of the great things of that era was cigarette card collecting. And every packet of cigarettes came with a different card in it. Sometimes, there were short runs. There were the ones that people really wanted to collect. There were other ones that there was just loads of. And he said somewhere that to make friends, he started collecting cards, swapping with people, selling them, making money. And he became very adept at this and helped start up what I think is still going, which is the Cartophilic Society, which is for people who collect stuff like this. Working in an auction house, I now know that nobody collects this anymore. It's like stamp collecting. It's on the wane, but it was huge in those days, and to the extent that he actually wrote the first official guide to collecting cigarette cards. It came out for £1, and it came out in the late 30s, and this was the go-to book for cigarette card collecting. And this copy has a note in it from a much later bookseller, Cartophilic salesperson, saying, whilst this book is still of very great value to all collectors, particularly beginners, it should be borne in mind when reading that it was written some time ago. Remember too that the opinions expressed by the author, Mr. F.T. Bason, are not necessarily accepted or endorsed by other dealers or collectors, or at least not at all. But in the absence of a later edition, however, This book is still good value and is still the only cheap guide to our mutual hobby, and if read with intelligence, should prove of great assistance to all collectors. So it wasn't just an amateur's book. He picked up from the bibliography. He's written a really useful reference book that is still in some cases used today. So there we go. Bookselling, autograph hunting, writing. He had all these streams coming in, but also he was driven by the need to make money. His father was a gambler. Famously, he won a tremendous amount on one greyhound race and spent it all in one day. So he was always trying to make sure he could still pay his rent, he could still get this money coming in. He wrote articles, loads and loads of articles, and his sheer industry, and Chris was talking about the sheer quantity of stuff and the sheer quantity of stuff you have passed over to Southwark Archives. He just wrote and wrote and wrote, and his sheer industry is incredible. So there he was doing all this and churning out articles as well. Incredible energy. So this takes us through the 1930s and then to wartime. And he was judged totally unfit to serve in the army or the services, so he became a full-time ARP warden. Now you can see in his ARP uniform with Southwark, and this, I think, is his mum looking on quizzically, and this is his next publication. And where he lived, there was still a lot of kids who hadn't been evacuated, and there was nothing for them to do, nothing, and they couldn't afford anything to do. And so he came up with this idea of, what are people throwing away? What can we use? Matchboxes, cigarette cards, cigarette packets, cotton reels. And he came up with this lovely idea of publishing. There were two. The first one was so successful, there was the second one, Toys for Nothing. And so what you've got here are all sorts of little things that you can make with basically a bit of glue, a matchbox, a cigarette card, some cardboard. And these sold really well, and the feedback that he got was they were very much appreciated by parents. So they could just say, here, get on with this, here's some glue and an old fag packet, you know, when you've got nothing else to provide for your children. So those were the next books. Eventually, in 1945, he was invited to take part in a series of books that some of you may remember, which was the Saturday book. All the articles he'd been writing came to the attention of the editor of this book. It was an annual that came out once a year until 1974, the year after Fred died. Beautifully produced. The one here you will see, number 15, they had their own boxes. Beautifully typeset, beautifully illustrated, and they did obscure topics, one of which was Fred himself, and Fred became almost the mascot. He was the only person who was published in every single issue from 1945 onwards. But it did odd things. It brought back to people Victoriana, shell pictures, steam graphs, Art Nouveau, and all these things that have been rejected and lost, particularly during the war. It brought these back to a wider audience, and Fred, on the back of that, started building fame up in a different direction, slightly more learned, slightly more literary. And again, if you get the chance to find any of these, you'll see them on eBay, second-hand bookshop for not a great deal, 3 or 4 quid. Fascinating to read, of their time, but also all sorts of interesting other bits as well as Fred being in them. And then the diaries, the famous diaries, 4 of them. what happened is, after he was seen in the Saturday book, the next logical step is Nicholas Bentley said, well, why don't we actually put a diary? You know, you've done so much, but let's put a diary in, you tell your story. And the first diary came out in 1951 and was incredibly successful. It had to be reprinted a couple of times. And then there was Diary 2, which followed up, and that Diary 1 was very much his theatrical experiences. Diary 2, boxing, more focused on boxing, edited by L.A.G. Strong, Leonard Strong, who was an Anglo-Irish writer, novelist, but also was a director of Longmans, I think it was. So a major literary figure. The third diary was introduced by Michael Sadleir. Have anybody heard of the interestingly titled Fanny by Gaslight? He wrote Fanny by Gaslight, and so it was more, he sort of had this more angle towards Victorian living, slums, etc. Also, this was one of the first dust jackets designed by Len Dayton, who was an illustrator as well as a novelist. And then the last one came out in 1960, The Last Bassoon. This is the book that brought me to Fred Bason, because it was edited by Noel Coward, who he knew, and it's just like, I don't remember reading this book by Noel Coward. And that got me into Fred Bason as a whole. And again, major on the theatrical, but also a lot of longer pieces about Walworth, better journalism, and I think it's his best book, because there's some lovely, lovely writing in there, which we'll come on to. So, those are really the core of Fred Bason's oeuvre. Lovely to read, easy to get hold of, and very, very worth reading. But also, he was asked to do talks, and this here, you'll see that's his second diary, and he became a speaker and was paid to travel to places as far and wide as Scotland, Cornwall, Norfolk, but not Walworth. He only ever did one talk in this borough, which was a huge, I'll come on to this, which he was perplexed about. But he was a very popular speaker, and again, approbation. He was a really good speaker, as David, you were saying, he was an affable man, he had loads of stories. He was a good storyteller, and he loved it. He loved it being the centre of attention. And that carried on all the way until his death, and started, from 1941 all the way through. This rather little photograph is in Southwark Archives now, and was in one of your photograph albums. Fred on television in 1948. I'm not entirely sure what all this is, possibly more things you can make out of fag packets. And it says, "To Lizzie, with my love, Fred." And Lizzie was, when his parents died, his landlady, who lived in the cellars of the house, started looking after him, and was a really important prop to him. And so there we go, on television. Not bad for somebody from Walworth. So he was building his fame, and this is again the public image. Sponsorship. This particularly dapper photograph is by Swallow Raincoats of Southend. And somehow he managed to blag Swallow Raincoats of Southend to actually pay him to advertise their raincoats, which he did. But he also, it's like with Somerset Maugham, he got it one way, he got it the other way. He got them to produce vast amounts of publicity for him in the way of postcards, which he used as calling cards. And what I think is hilarious is with these here, you can follow his progression. This one here says, "Fred Bason, best known of all modern Cockney authors, sends cordial greetings to you, and it says diarist, broadcaster, lecturer. The next one, Fred Bason, 60 times on the BBC, 14 times on TV, author of 9 books. Sends cordial greetings. The next one, 62 times on the BBC, 14 times on the TV, and author of 10 books. Sends cordial greetings. And the last one in the series, 65 times on the BBC, 16 times on TV, author of 11 books. Sends cordial greetings to you. So he let everybody know how his career was building. But he used these also to publicize his talk. So this says, anytime, anywhere at any time, I will speak at any kind of club for nice people. Or extremely small fee asked. I am alone in this world and like to meet people. Fred Bason. Talk at any club and promises faithfully not only to hold your entire attention, but make you laugh. And so he was very, very good at self-publicity, very, very engaging and good with his outreach. But it's how he used these relationships. It's very interesting to see. Some of you may remember Tyne brand products, tin stew. Was a student. Yes, it was horrible. But the managing director of Tyne Brands Food, which was in North Shields, happened to be at school in Walworth with Fred Bason. And when he was publishing books, said, "Oh, I remember you." And so Tyne Brands sponsored Fred. And again, he reused. Fred Bason has a picnic. He's actually in the Saturday book, but he actually decanted it into this. They paid him for this. And again, copies were sent out all over the place. Swallow raincoats on the right. Another thing, in the Saturday book, you decant it into a little book, you send it out for publicity, he gets paid for it. He was really, really good at, turning a penny. And more. Royal Doulton, who were based on the South Bank. There is still an amazing building which was their offices, which is the only bit left, bombed flat, and then the roads were widened, and then with the Clean Air Act they had to relocate to Stoke-on-Trent. But while they were here, spring and summer were written about, and this is coming back to auction houses, Doulton figurines, ladies in various positions, and there was one which was called Spring and one that was called Summer, and so he produced these limited edition books which would be sold with the figurines to enhance the sales of these items. Autumn and winter never appeared, sadly, as Doulton moved up to Stoke and the relationship faltered. But the important thing with this is that because of the diaries, Fred's profile in America was very, very high, and they were looking on him as being a slightly Dick Van Dyke type Londoner. And so a lot of these companies, Doulton in particular, used Fred to promote their Londonness to an American audience. So again, this two-way relationship. He got the fame, they got the sales, he got the money for the books. It was a sort of win-win situation. Even in the 1960s, Fred was on television talking about his works and his diaries and all the rest of it. You'll notice the impressive kipper tie. You'll notice that this, which is Nicholas Bentley's caricature of him, which was in one of the diaries. And you'll also notice that Fred is wearing his Swallow Raincoats blazer, so he never forgot to promote, his loyalty to his supporters never failed. But the 60s were coming into a bit of decline for the public side of Fred. And we've got here an interview from the Times in 1970 where Fred went very public about being lonely. and about his career finishing, which is a funny sort of way to get publicity about your lack of publicity, but that was how he managed to blag this. And one of the things that people found in later days is there was something almost slightly whiny about Fred. Fred Bason is a Cockney, sorry folks, born in Walworth in 1907, a barrow's push from the Elephant and Castle, and a sharp ears shot from the Bow Bells. He is among London's best-known Cockneys in America, but in his native London he is a lonely, sad man in danger of being forgotten. So forgotten that he got an interview in the Times. So there is always an irony about it, and this became a bit of a trope with Fred. I've got no relatives, I'm lonely, I'm sad, da, 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 da. And thank God for David's father, who actually provided a social network for David. So David's father was the vicar of Walworth, and his relationship with Fred, your family's support for him, was actually really important in these later years. So even though he was saying, I'm lonely, he still had his strong local networks. Then, suddenly, he died. He wasn't worthy of an obituary, but he got a notice, at least in the Times. Again, a Cockney, sorry, Walworth. And he died when he was staying with a friend. Your father had moved down to Merstham, another parish, and he was staying with another vicar friend in Oxfordshire, and he died there very suddenly at the age of 65. And it's interesting, this slightly patronising tone here. His highly idiosyncratic diaries, which were published over a number of years, abounded in sharp observation, sentiment, and bizarre recollections of places, institutions, and authors, and the buying and selling of books. So there's this sort of slight puzzlement about Fred. He died in 1973. So that's the public man, and that's the end of his career. A sort of diminuendo, a sort of, oh, I feel slightly forgotten now, even though I'm telling the whole world that I've been slightly forgotten. But there is much more behind the public story, and that, we go back to my first slide. What did he do? Yes, he was a witness to his times locally and nationally. Look at the diaries. Fabulous records. Why should he be remembered? Did he record local life and times? Yes, he did. Did he bring Walworth and Camberwell to the world? I will show you. Was he part of the local landscape? Well, yes. Was he a local celebrity? No. And a local hero? No. And that is really what's interesting about the man himself. So as I say, these were worldwide sellers. He was a witness to his times, and I can't recommend enough reading them. Once you get over the I'm lonely and I don't have any relatives bit, there's some really, really interesting records, streetscapes, stories, the theatre, boxing, all that is fascinating. But as his career declined, he also became very involved locally, and David's father established a journal, a newspaper called the Walworth Compass, and that was produced by the church and had a very, very local circulation indeed. And so suddenly Fred was writing stuff that didn't go around the world. It sort of went up and down the Walworth Road and in and out of Surrey Square. But he put as much care and attention into writing for the Walworth Compass and for a local audience than he did writing for his, people in America or whatever. And there's a lovely bit here where he says, I was 21 when my mother bought me a rather battered second-hand piano. It's the only present she ever gave me. Relationships with parents. She sold it before I was 22 and had a beauty treatment and her hair tinted blue with the proceeds of selling my piano. I never forgave her this piece of downright cruelty, and I never owned a piano since. Fame. I suppose the high point now, opposite where the huge hole where the tube station is at the moment, and where the new what is it called? The new building designed by Erna Goldfinger. What's it called? Metro Central. Used to be a colossal department store called Tarn and Company, and an even bigger, amazing, multiple cinema called the Trocadero.
Yeah.
You know it?
I know. I've seen pictures of the department store.
The most amazing sort of French fancy, and then you had this.
Actually go into it?
No. It was knocked down well before my time. Well, I think, sort of. Mid-60s. He says, I suppose the high point of my piano was at the old Trocadero cinema at Elephant and Castle. Just before the last World War, I stood on that huge stage. Apparently you could get 3,000 people in the cinema. On that huge stage, 3 shows a day for 2 weeks in a stage show called In Town Tonight. I was the only one in Walworth who'd actually appeared on the BBC In Town Tonight, so the manager asked me to appear and paid me 30 shillings a week for a 4-minute appearance. It's always money. The act. What can you do, Fred? He said. Oh, I can play the piano, I replied with complete confidence, although I don't suppose I touched a piano for 2 years. What can you play? Oh, anything. You name it and I'll play it. Well, that's splendid. Why not go on and ask the audience to name the tune? And I said I do a little better than that. I give 3 to anyone who could call out a tune I couldn't play. And that was the act. And I was allowed to practice all Sunday afternoon on grand piano, and the management provided unlimited tea and biscuits. Amongst the others in the cast of the show were Stan Laurel's father, the racing tipster Prince Monolulu, the fat boy of Will Hayes films, and Dave Crawley, a lightweight boxer. Very mixed cast, and every night fresh celebrities made fleeting 3 or 4 minute appearances. I went on the stage at about 4 o'clock on the Monday. I was a bit nervous, only because the piano was so huge and the stage was so big and I was so small. I said that the only reason I was on the stage was because I was the only local person who had actually appeared on the radio In Town Tonight. I was not a stage star or stage struck. I couldn't sing. My violin playing would break your heart. But if you call out a tune, I will play it at once, or if I failed, I give you a 3 bit as a souvenir of the occasion. You beat Bason. Well, in 2 weeks, I lost 9p. Only 3 tunes were called out, which I couldn't play. Indeed, it would have taken a Paderewski or a Liberace to play those classical pieces. But you see, on the 2nd week, when the films were changed and the audience returned, they'd looked up the names of the difficult pieces to trap me with. But I was soon wise to that. I listened as they called out the tunes, and then when I heard a tune called out that I knew, I played that and ignored the tricky titles. There's a trick in everything. I got £3 for my 2 weeks at the Troc, and some 50 quite good autographs of real celebrities who made only 1 appearance and probably got 30 times more for 1 appearance than I got 3 times a day for 2 weeks. But after 2 weeks, I'd learnt such a lot about facing the audience with a cool, calm manner that when I commenced public speaking in 1941, I wasn't afraid. I've since given over 800 talks in public with never a moment of apprehension or butterflies in the belly. And this is about all I can remember of piano notes, except that once I had tea with Rachmaninoff, but that's another story. Tell you some other time. Bye. So he just wrote really well in a lovely conversational way, and he wrote with the same skills for his audience here as he did for his audience in America and around the world. He also, and I know obviously Reverend David Hammond was very much about supporting the local community. There was a lot of change, a lot of the community around here broke up, a lot of traditional street patterns went, and there were a lot of lonely people who didn't know what was going on. And in another one of his columns, Fred wrote, "Soon Christmas will be upon us, and there will be at least 500 people in Walworth who are, like myself, entirely alone in this world, without a wife, family or relations. No doubt some of you will feel a bit sorry for these unfortunate lonely people who've outlived their families and friends, but do better than feel sorry. Find just one of these old folks and invite her or him into your home for a cup of tea during the so-called festive season. They will not steal your silver teaspoons or your doormat. They will be deeply grateful that someone cared enough to spare one cup of tea and a little while for conversation. It's the period of goodwill, but I wonder how much goodwill you'll have." And so it was quite nice that he actually said, you know, think about your neighbours, think about this local community. And that means that there is, yes, we've got the public side, but this personal side was much kinder-hearted, I think, than it would perhaps appear. This is a cutting that I found pasted into a copy of a book. And again, apologies to Walworth. This focuses on Camberwell. Mr. Bason will tell the world about Camberwell and himself. A smiling young cockney, complete with choker and cloth cap, which we saw earlier, will go to Broadcasting House on Tuesday and tell the Empire how much he likes Camberwell. Well, if that's not telling the world about living around here, I don't know what is. It's a slight, again, a lot of the attitude to Fred was slightly patronising. You see it says here, interesting personality. And it says, 2 years ago, Mr. Bason was invited to make his first broadcast. He was so nervous he failed at the test. "I feel confident this time," he told me, "and I shall be able to tell the Empire why I like Camberwell and why I will not move from it until I've made my fortune." When Mr. Bason leaves his quaint little shop, he will go home to teach his five pupils, the piano and violin. After that, he will probably play some of the 5 instruments of which he is adept, and then do some more writing. You know, he obviously bigged himself up at that stage to the South London press. So he took Camberwell to the world a long time before a lot of other people did. But also, and thank you for Chris for digging this out, this comes through to the fact that he wasn't really accepted. He was a bit different. There are a lot of histories of Walworth and a lot of quite recent books on Walworth, and not a mention of Fred, as if he didn't really fit into this environment. He was a bit of an outsider, and I think people were a bit wary about him. And Chris, thank you for digging out this piece. This is something that he wrote, obviously, on a rainy day when nothing was happening in May 1958, and it says, "If 90% of the people of my district of London had to write a 10,000 word article or a 60,000 word book or die, they'd die. I put it at 90%, but probably 99% would be fairer. I live in the wrong district. I'm constantly getting nasty little snicks and snags thrown at me. I'm not manly because I write books, and I'm not married. If the women were womanly, I'd very much show them how manly I am. But looking at most of them, I think a hot water bottle is more wholesome. Judging from their language, probably a lot more clean. Why on earth do so many working class people have the wrong impression about such as poets and ballet dancers? It's all wrong. If the fools knew the strain, the physical endurance and the essential fitness of ballet dancers, they'd very, very soon change their tune. And poets. I've only met 3 poets, as far as I can recall, and they were men. W.H. Davis, James Stephens, John Drinkwater. W.H. Davis had more guts than any 2 of the average man of today. He was brave and stuck to his guns. A soldier of poetry. And where do silly people get this bloody silly idea that an author is a pansy because he's an author? They ought to meet Ernest Hemingway and fill his fist. I wonder if Mr. Samuel Pepys was surrounded by unkind people who thought he was daft or sexually incorrect because he kept a diary. I hope the Sir John Wolfenden report, and that was the one that prejudiced the 1967 Act, will help a lot of really unlucky, through no fault of their own people. But I long for the day when my working class population will get a little more understanding and not put people into groups. He's a lord, so he must be super rich and blue-blooded and a snob. That's not so. Some lords are quite poor. He's in the ballet, so he must be a pansy. It's not so. He writes books, so he must be an eccentric. I've had to fight this nearly 30 years in Walworth. Why don't I move? Well, here I get things to write about, as I've written about this today. For because of bad trade, there's nothing else to write about today. And so it's this insight, this aware of his own difference and of not belonging, but also a really tolerant attitude. And again, I was talking to Chris about this. A lot of he didn't marry. He knew a lot of gay men, but I didn't think he was gay, but he had an affinity with that world. That marked him out as an outsider. And so he found it quite difficult to integrate. And what he was actually talking about here, I think even now, we have people who say, oh, well, so-and-so, ballet dancers are all gay, or writers are just weird. I mean, it's getting through typecasting, getting through people appearing to be one thing, but actually they're people. A local celebrity, when they were knocking down all the houses to clear the Aylesbury estate, again he got into the South London papers. That's the South London Observer, and the one on the right is an interesting one from the South London Press. Cockney author Fred Bason has waited a lifetime for recognition of the people of Walworth, the area he refuses to be parted from. And on October the 27th, he takes his first step to becoming known locally when he talks about his life to an audience at the Civic Centre on the Old Kent Road. And that's the one, very modernist one, with the most amazing mosaics if you go past it. The man who has written 15 books and 2,000 articles will at last be able to attempt to break the barrier that has separated him from the people of Walworth. But I'm not expecting very much, said Mr. Bason. People all over the world read my work, but I don't suppose I've ever sold 2 books in Walworth. Local people have never shown the slightest interest. Although I have addressed hundreds of meetings all over the country, this is the first time that anyone has asked me to speak in Walworth. And after 58 years living at 152 Westmoreland Road, Mr. Bason has moved to a new council flat at 4 Broadmain, Portland Street. I didn't want to move, but they wanted my old home for development. But at least I now have a bathroom, he said. So that shows his relationship was very ambivalent with the local area, from his writing here, which was not published, and this, which was an interview. So it was sort of squaring his personal experience with all the stuff he got from the rest of his life. And I'm afraid, colleagues in Southwark Libraries, I took a copy of this. Just the year before he died, he was writing to them about National Book Week and a previous Southwark Archives, the Borough Librarian and Curator said, a local eccentric, do you want this letter on file at all? And somebody's written back, but well known, the Sage of Peckham, is it, or Walworth? And so even locally, he was still not known, and that's partly what tonight is about, is to try and address that lack of local awareness. I must say you're much better at it now. So. One of the things I want to read, and thank you David and Joanne for the permission, is a letter that was written by David's father to a book collector called Paul Robinson. And this was written by the Reverend David Hammond in 1997, long after he'd left Walworth. But explains an awful lot about his experiences of Fred. Yeah. Dear Paul, thank you for your letter asking me information about Fred Bason. I was the vicar of All Saints and St Stephen's, Surrey Square, Walworth from 62 to 72, and Fred was one of my parishioners. I go further and say that although he was an infrequent worshipper, nevertheless he was a friend to me and my family. My 3 boys called him Uncle Fred. He would often share Sunday lunch with us, and my late wife Lily would darn his socks and do other needlework for him. I met Fred at my induction as a vicar in 1962. He came up to me and said, "Hello, I'm Fred Bason, the Cockney author," and it went from there. I have to admit I'd never heard of him. But then I didn't have a television set and I wasn't actually an avid listener to Woman's Hour. You may have noted that his house at 152 Westmoreland Road had a hand-painted plaque by the front door that said Fred Bason, author. If this sounds a bit boastful, don't knock it. And this, I think, is really telling. Fred had dragged himself up from the gutter. You'll know that from his diaries. And he was right to be proud of what he'd achieved. He was the only person in our locality who had risen to some fame without going through the prison service or the boxing ring. Once you understood this, Fred was a lot easier to understand. What was sad was that none of the locals appreciated this, and as far as I can tell, he was quite without friends in the local community, except for us and the parish priests at Pembroke College Mission on Barlow Street. During the time I knew him, Fred wasn't writing much. The last bassoon had been published, and when I read it, I found it contained a lot of repetition, or is it because I'd heard most of the things from Fred himself directly? Fred's house at 152 was full of books. During the time we knew him, Fred's day-to-day income came from buying and selling second-hand books. He'd go off, bag in hand, early in the morning to the market, Petticoat Lane, Kingsland Road, or nearer home, East Street, sort through the books on sale in the stalls. He'd always be first in the queue at jumble sales, and if he could get in before, he would get in to get a clear run at the books. His fear was that one day he wouldn't be able to do this and he'd be left without an income except an old age pension. So he was exceedingly mean with money. Hence Lily, my wife, mending his socks and turning his sheets, bought second hands, side to middle. The crunch came when Southwark Council wanted to pull down Westmoreland Road. Fred was offered a new flat in a tower block in Portland Street, Walworth. What was he to do? Of course he called on us. By this time we were quite expert at helping people move. The borough's wholesale clearance, in preparation for building of the Aylesbury estate, meant that many elderly and handicapped people had to pull up their roots, and we acted as go-between. Fred found some curtains at a jumble sale. Lily did her sewing. We shifted his precious books and possessions in the car, bit by bit, but the council paid for the furniture to go. Finally, there he was, in a new flat on the second floor. It was warm and clean and almost tidy, and it stayed warm, but soon acquired the atmosphere of 152 in the other respects. After a while, Fred was back in his old ways, though a lot warmer than before. There were problems. One day early on, Fred ran the bath and the hot water tap came off in his hand, leaving a jet of scalding water hitting the ceiling. He went looking for a stopcock but couldn't find it. He ran for the caretaker to find it was his day off. The locum wasn't there. He went across to the road where they were building another tower block and found the workman. The plumber came over, unscrewed a panel in the airing cupboard, turned off the steaming column in the bathroom. This took 10 minutes. And as you can imagine, the problems it caused, not only with the flat, but the people in the flat below. We moved to South Merstham in 1972. And one of the sad things was saying goodbye to Fred. While he was infuriating and pompous and often selfish, nevertheless we liked him. As I said at the address I gave at his memorial service, Fred was transparent. He was infuriating because he said what he felt. He didn't cover anything up. This was the reason he wasn't liked by the locals. They didn't see behind what he showed them, and didn't understand the way he felt and thought. He climbed out of their culture in most respects, even though his speech and many other things were still Cockney. So I just think that's really interesting how, people who knew him very well, who got to know him very socially, he didn't quite fit. But how many great writers don't fit? They are outsiders. They do have a clearer view of that community, of what's going on. At heart, he said, I never wished to be a huge mirror reflecting great truths of the universe. At best, I wanted to be just a small pocket mirror, reflecting a little blemish, small amount of fun, little truth, some laughter, and maybe a few tears. And this was written in the last diaries. I hope in this book I've done some of those things, and all in all I please you, and that you in turn speak kindly in my diaries, and so perhaps bring me to a brand new reader. Always reaching out. Just at the end, I'd like to give my thanks to Joanne and David Hammond for allowing me to read this, and for oodles of research and first-hand experience of Fred. John Wilson, who isn't here tonight, who is still a bookseller, although retired, with Mags, and he used to go to Fred's flat on Portland Street, and he said Fred would be sitting there surrounded by this stuff, and he'd say, what about that? And it would be a letter from Agatha Christie, and of course Mags would buy it, and he was just selling stuff, living, that was his pension. And I'd like to thank Paul Robinson, to whom this letter was written. And as an ending, that is the most weird photograph you could possibly send out to people. He sent it out to a lot of people. I've got a copy, you've got a copy in the archives, and he was sort of quite proud of this. But it is a bit deathly looking. And there we have All Saints, the interior. And there we have Reverend Hammond's funeral service, which I have a copy of. And there is St Mary, Orton, Waterville, where Fred is actually buried. And somebody who unfortunately can't be with us tonight was inspired by Fred as an art student in Brighton, and she wrote the last book that was produced for or by Fred, called Common Markets, and it uses the same typeface as Fred's first diary, and it's about some text that Fred wrote, and sadly he died before this was produced, about London street markets. And Antonia can't be here, but she said I can show you this. It inspired her to do some lovely images, and that's her picture of Fred. And Fred in standard mood is saying, I never ever wanted to join the common market because I consider myself to be most uncommon, and I cannot say that I've enjoyed the company of French, Germans, Belgians or Italians, and because, well, they're so very un-English, which is not true, because he had a great time and indeed great romances in Germany and loved travelling around the Med when he could. But anyway, typical curmudgeonly Fred at the end of his days, but also inspired her to the most beautiful screen prints. She's still doing prints of East Street Market, and I think they are the colours are just, what Fred inspired her to create are just these lovely, lovely images. But not forgotten. Last year, the Book Collector announced a podcast that's free, and one of our colleagues, his father is a quite well-known book dealer, Clive Farraher. He has read the whole of Fred Bason's first diary into a free podcast. And so if you ever want to go on and hear not in an authentically Walworth accent, but anyway, it's worth reading because he really makes it live and approachable, and you don't have to find one of these. But what this shows is that even now, particularly with going back to his experience in the book trade, is that he is starting to reappear. There's another book that came out by Travis Elborough called London 365. Every day he takes a different diary or letter written about or in London, and Fred is in that. So hopefully this is part of making people more aware of Fred Bason and what he did. My thanks in concluding, to Southwark Archives, to Lisa, to Chris, and to Patricia as well, to Joanne David and John Wilson, and my thanks to Fred Bason. And my last parting thing, how are we doing, is I'm just going to read you a little bit from the Len Dayton covered third diary, which is called Southwark Serenade. And this shows how, although he was, not recognised by his area, how he wrote so lovingly about it. This is 1955. It's evening. I am seated at the window of my study trying to read. Across the road is the local school, and above the school is a bonfire of sunset to bring us a close to a lovely summer's evening. The sunset casts a glow on the dear little children who in their dozens are screaming, both in the playground out of the school and in the street outside my window. Children everywhere. It's said that no man is a real man around this part of London until he's given his wife 4 or 5 children. There are a lot of real men in this neighbourhood. Just below me there is a sweet little boy with a spade that's taller than him. Alas for him and the others, there is today no sand or mud, so he's just amusing his sweet self by bashing the spade down on the pavement and making a noise. This noise, no doubt, amuses him, but it will wake the dead. Only this isn't a day for dying. Nearby, a boy is throwing large bricks up in the air and letting them fall to pieces on the ground. I'm willing to lay 6 to 4 that he doesn't know what game he's playing, except that it also makes more noise and dust. One dear little boy has kicked violently at the door of his home for at least 6 times in the last hour, screamed out for his mother to come down so that he can go in and get a cup of water. She comes down every time, lets him in. Now he wants to go in to make water, so she's coming down again. She's a little tired, but down she comes, and I can hear her above the din of a nearby radio set. The people who own the radio are very kind people and love to share their pleasures, and so I have no need whatever to put my own radio on. I can always hear theirs with the greatest comfort, or discomfort as the case may be. The screams and the radio make quite a din, all part of the pattern of the serenade. And so it's this lovely love-hate relationship with the area in which he lives, of being part of something that he is an observer of, but he's still part of. So, there we go. Last word to Fred Bason. But I hope I've encouraged you to go out, find a bit more, do a bit of research, get a copy of the Saturday book, get one of these, or even go online. Let's go back. Go online and you can listen to somebody else reading it to you while you're doing something else.
What's the website?
It is, if you go to the Book Collector podcasts, it's freely downloadable and it's in 12 easily digestible sections. So there you go, Fred Bason, local character. Thank you.